And 96, the rooms in my house are smaller than they used to be. Or maybe it's my eyes. The hallway light throws long, thin shadows. The rug makes a sound like a tired sea when I walk on it. I am used to waking in the dark now, used to counting breaths and cataloging pains, hips, knees, a memory that drops like pebbles into water and sinks without a ripple. I keep a lamp by the chair where I read the mail. I keep a radio tuned low to the old news. I keep an envelope of photographs in the top drawer of the old dresser. Brittle edges, faces that smile in the wrong light. The night he came back, I sat up and listened. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old wood does that. An exhale, a soft click. Then the sound moved on the stair, patient as a question. The door to the study eased open. I smelled cold air and something colder, like the smell that hangs in the cavern of an engine, oil and metal and the faint sweetness of old fuel. For a heartbeat, I thought it was some dream pressing against the membrane between sleep and wake. Then I saw him in the doorway. I know how that sentence sounds. Ghost stories are for gutters and stage lights. But the man who stood in the doorway had the shape of a soldier I had made impossible for decades. The slump of shoulders drawn in against winter, the hollow right eye that caught the light, the neat crop of hair he could never have kept clean in the field. He was not there to frighten me with some elaborate theatrics. He stood quiet, like a man who had been waiting. He did not have a name I could pin to him. I never knew his name. We had been 3 feet apart in a world that smelled of smoke when I took the shot. He fell, and I ran. Decades later, I could not tell you whether he had children, or a hometown, or a voice that hummed in the same key as mine. What I could remember, with a clarity that made my chest ache, were the details that wore leaves, the way his pack hung at an awkward angle, the small silver buckle catching the light, the damp of cold pressed into the seams of his uniform. I remembered the angle of the earth when he went down, the sound that cut across the night like a snapped wire. He looked at me as if he were measuring distance. When his mouth moved, the room kept its breath. "You remember," he said. It was not a voice from a radio. It was the voice of a man who had once stood where I stood and had decided that this was the cost of being seen. If I had believed in signs, I would have called this a sign. But I am a man who learned to call facts what they are and not more. So I call it what it felt like, an impossible presence that set every old thing humming. I watched the wallpaper peel at the corner by the fireplace and felt the blood in my temples. For a moment, I wanted to deny it, to say the noise had been the cat or the wind, to close my eyes and return to the safe ledger of aches. Instead, I answered in the only way I had learned to answer in a life of small confessions. "I remember," I said. Silence tightened. The man stood and looked not like an accusing stranger, but like an unreadable ledger, pages kept together by a single brittle staple. If this touches you, if these old voices matter to you, subscribe and listen to more stories like this. There are other men who hold similar ghosts. There are other nights when the past sits down in the chair beside you and stares at your hands. He did not move when I spoke of memory. Instead, the thinness of him folded the room back into the years I have tried to contain in a single box at the bottom of my dresser. The light on his cheekbone turned the same way the late afternoon sun had turned the shine of a stack of jerry cans in Hansfeld. I am telling you about Hansfeld because that is where the thread begins, the place where logistics and hunger and the smell of benzene made a man into a decision. December 17th, 1944. At least that is the date that lives in me. Around then, we stumbled on a supply dump outside a little town with a name that tasted like stone, Hansfeld. The maps called it by a name that did not suit the mud and the sky. We found jerry cans in neat pyramids, rows of them like coffins for engines. Gasoline, pale, shimmering, the color of old lemon rind, lay in drums and pumps. For weeks we had been starving for fuel. Tanks choked on the road, trucks idled and grew cold as soldiers grew stubborn.
An army marches on supply lines. What people call valor is often an argument with logistics. The Ardennes was a place where that argument turned bitter. I remember the first time I stepped into that yard. The air was sharp with frost and something sweeter, fuel, but also the kind of hope that smells like warm bread. Men laughed in the way men laugh when a scarcity is lifted, thin, sudden, and almost frightened by its own noise. We filled jerry cans like boys filling pockets with stolen candy. We watched engines cough to life. Someone said, "This is the war handed to us on a platter," and you could see the relief in noses and in the way men let go of their clenched hands for a moment. We were a mixed crowd there, infantry, engineers, truck drivers who had slept on cold metal and still woke with frozen breath. Our officers barked orders. I remember a lieutenant whose face resembled a map of lines where the bone met the skin. He wanted trucks out, lines of fuel hauled, the supply system humming again. Our life for those hours was nothing but movement. The scent of fuel became a religion. There is a thing about armies and supplies. They make you measure life in miles per gallon. I won't stand here and lecture about strategy and campaign plans. I'm not a scholar. But I could see in the faces of men who had been living on rationed hope how much good a single barrel could do. Fuel meant mobility, and mobility meant the difference between being cut off and being resupplied.
The reason we celebrated in that yard was not because of glee at taking something from someone else. It was because for a few hours, the machine we were part of might, just might, move. The memory threads through me like cold wire. I can still hear the clink of metal as lids popped and the dull thud when a can was set down. I can still see the stacks and the way the sun glanced off the painted letters on the drums. Men joked about driving straight to Berlin. Others sobbed and laughed in the same minute. We loaded trucks, and some of us, greedy or practical, I cannot say now, stowed extra cans in corners and behind seats. There was a frenzy to it, not different in its physics from the stampede for anything men must have to survive. I want to be clear. The men who organized the Wehrmacht supplies were professionals, and the unit that had been there had no mercy to do with us finding their dump. They have names in history, and some of them faced justice later. I have been told stories since, about commanders and trials, about how some who ordered atrocities were brought to book. Those are not consolations for me. They are facts that hang like plaques on a wall I pass but cannot see from where I stand. It was in that landscape of cans and cold that I met the man who would return to my doorway 70-odd years later. We collided, not with a single designed purpose, but with the chaos that happens when two desires cross on a narrow path. He was carrying an armful, 2 cans, maybe 3, and he didn't see me. The road was slick. His foot slid on frost. I pushed. He stumbled. I shouted. He turned quickly, eyes full of alarm, and for a breath the world narrowed to the bronze of his buckle and the glint of his mouth opening. There was a gun somewhere, always a gun in those places, and in the confusion it went off. That is how I remember it. The pulse, the hollow sound of impact, the scuff of boots on frost. I did what men do who live under orders and fear. I moved away. It is not a defense, it is report. There is a sameness to memory and to regret. To say that I fired because I intended to kill would be a lie. To say I did not intend harm would be a lie as well. War is made of 1,000 small lies, of intentions and actions that never line up neatly. I do not recall the man's face after he fell. I recall instead the way snow closed up around him, how the cold trimmed his edges, how the laughter of other men sounded like birds that had been startled from a wire. We kept working. There is a cruelty to war that fashions habit into armor. You put your hands on a can, you lift, you nod, you pass by a body, and you do not look hard because the work must be done. That is one of the reasons guilt has weight, because the body you left is a place where responsibility collects and makes small mountains. Later that night, later in the way time softens edges, I would walk in my sleep with that face in my pocket. I would wake with the taste of metal on my tongue and the feel of frost in my hands. Names are the things that make people real. I never knew his. I only knew the shape of his death and the physics of the moment. The next memory is not a courtroom.
It is a field where men burned their own supplies rather than allow them to be taken. I remember columns of flame. I remember American engineers setting fire to the drums to deny use to anyone who might follow. Somewhere in it, I remember being told that 2 million gallons had been torched in a scorched attempt at strategy. We watched the fire like a funeral pyre for engines. The sky over Stavelot, as some call it, was a day with pillars of black smoke like questions. You could see it from a long way off. Men who had cheered at the sight of fuel now watched it burn and understood something ugly about the calculus of war. Sometimes the value of what you destroy outstrips the value of what you keep. When I reflect on those moments, I am always brought to the idea of abundance versus scarcity. The German machine could have kept a war going with enough fuel. The Allied machine could keep going because industry roared behind it. We had trucks and roads and an appetite for movement the other could not sustain. Tanks rusted where they fell if there were no fuel to get them home. Men starved or froze where the logistical web failed. That reality shapes how a man in a uniform counts moral weight. You do things to survive, but survival has its own ledger. And so the man I killed is part of that ledger. He is a footnote to logistics and a headline in my conscience. He is the reason I lay awake now when the house makes the sound of settling and think of metal being stacked and of men throwing their hands up and saying, "God, spare us that." The past, for a man my age, is not a movie played once and filed. It is a room you walk into and find certain furniture where it shouldn't be. Back in my chair, the man in the doorway had shifted his weight. He did not look like someone from a faded picture. He looked like a man who had been up all night. "Do you remember that yard?" he asked. It is a strange thing to be asked whether you remember. Remembering is supposed to be mine, private and sequenced. But the voice, if it was a voice, set loose a flurry of images that came in jagged breaths. The thin laughter, a sergeant with a handkerchief stained by the cold, the way a tongue of flame licked the rim of a drum when they burned them, the smell of benzene that seemed to seep into everything. I could have said no and been told I was lying. Instead, I said, every bit of it. He moved then, almost imperceptibly. I do not know why I studied his hands. They were clean, as if a decade of dirt had been wiped away. The nails were intact. There was no blood, of course. There was no wound to show. That was what frightened me more than anything. The ease with which the past could be smoothed into a figure you could look at, and for a moment mistake for something finished. "Why?" he said. It was not a question that wanted an answer so much as a name being called out in prayer. "Because I thought I had to," I said. It felt like the worst truth and the least. Words worn thin by use will sometimes be all that remain between a man and the black hole of shame. I was old enough then to know what an honest answer can do. Nothing, mostly. It can also do everything. Confession seldom cancels consequence. It sometimes lessens the load in a way that allows the rest of life to proceed. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. I meant atonement. I meant physical restitution. I meant any of the 100 things that the mind of a man with a heavy pocket of history wants to buy. He walked toward the chair until his shadow fell over my hands. "To be remembered," he said. "To be seen." That is an odd thing to hear. To be remembered is not a demand that would usually be granted to the living from the dead. But memory is currency for the living. We spend it to purchase meaning. I had been spending mine on everything but the man in the doorway. On lists of battles and dates, on medals, and on the story I told my grandchildren about courage. For the first time in a very long time, I felt the weight of a single omission. When you get to be a certain age, you begin to think in practicalities. There are files to sort, wills, a box of old letters that grandchildren will not understand. There are also the private things, The little rituals that keep you from being swallowed whole by the past. I keep a folded map under the ledger where I write my lists. I keep a photograph of a tank, museum piece now, on which I once sharpened my resentment like a blade. I keep a small metal buckle wrapped in tissue paper that I found in a pocket a day or two after Hansfeld. It is still there, and in the lamplight, it shines like a promise. The man in the doorway watched me as though he expected me to rise and hand him something. He might have been waiting for me to do that. Instead, I moved to the dresser and opened the drawer where the photographs lay. My hands trembled in the way that makes people think you have a sickness that will one day be named. I had kept those pictures for a reason. They were evidence of life, of us, and of them. They were also a way of not telling the whole story. I pulled out a corner photograph and let it rest on my knee. It was one of those pictures taken in that sharp light that hates flattery. Tanks stood idle behind a line of men who were smiling in a way that did not reach their eyes. There was a little blister of frost on the top left corner. I ran my finger over it. Photographs are strange things. They flatten a moment into a relic and make you feel both present and absent in the same breath. "Do you want me to forgive you?" the man asked.
Forgiveness is a business everyone is qualified to sell, but no one can buy on credit. You cannot demand it. You cannot wring it out of someone. And certainly, you cannot ask the dead to give it on your timetable. The way he phrased it, like an accountant asking a question about a ledger, made me think of all the times I had tried to make sense of things on equations that did not add up. "I have carried you," I said, and meant it in the literal and the figurative sense. My heart ached like a muscle strained by motion. I had built a life around being decent in other small ways, paying rent on time, taking meals to a neighbor, telling the truth about the weather and the state of my knees. Those things rub at conscience like an emery board on calluses. They do not, however, sand away the deeper grooves. "Then do it," he said. "Say it." There is a theater of confession in which words are the props. People stand in front of altars and mutter the right syllables and find themselves made whole. I have no altar. I have a chair, a lamp, and a voice that has been trained by decades of holding uncomfortable truths quietly. In the winter of my life, though, something felt different. The presence in the doorway was not malicious. It was not even particularly devout. It was simply the insistence of a debt. "I am sorry," I said. The words tasted like old coins, familiar, small, not as powerful as their cost. Saying them did not dissolve the man into smoke. It did not unlock a bank account or bring back a child to a widow. It did not force history to rewrite itself. But something subtle shifted. The air seemed to thin and then expand. He nodded as if he had been expecting greater fanfare and decided that this would do. "Do you know my name?" he asked again. I closed my eyes. I could reach back to all the catalogs in my head, the names of officers and the names of towns and the color of a truck. Everywhere, my mind found organizational places to store things. Names of single soldiers who died under circumstances like that have a way of being swallowed by larger texts. For every casualty plan and casualty list, there are dozens of men whose names dissolved into unknown. I had, in the cold grace of those days, checked faces, but not always names. That is a failing I have lived with. "I never knew it," I said. "Then remember me as a man," he told me, "not as a thing you did." There is cruelty in the way a single night can break a man into simple parts. For years I had rehearsed my narrative, self-preserving and tidy. I would say, I did what I had to, and the sentence closed like a lid. Now it opened again, and in the opening I found a responsibility I had not wanted to hold. We spoke then, in a way I had not expected. The conversation was not long. It was not melodramatic. It was the clumsy, halting exchange of two people, separated by an ocean of years,
but sharing a small boat of guilt.
Sometimes he asked about the yard. Sometimes he asked about small details, like the color of a muffler or whether my friend Tanner had laughed that day. He did not ask for facts I can no longer confidently deliver. He asked for the weight of a memory to be moved, and for me, at last, to let it rest somewhere true. "Will you come with me to the museum?" I heard myself say before I could stop the voice. It was a ridiculous offer. I am not a man who travels much anymore. My legs remember the taste of asphalt and prefer the comfort of carpet. But the offer felt right in a way that words sometimes are before they prove their meaning. The museum, I meant the place in town where a captured tank sits on display, where children are allowed to run their hands over metal and ask why men make such machines. It is both a memorial and a piece of steel that has been given the opinion of being educational. He smiled, just once, and in that creased smile, the man who had staggered in my memory for so long became less sharp around the edges. "Yes," he said. "Go." There are decisions you make in a life that are small in the moment, but come to be large metaphors later. Rising from the chair to go to the museum would be one of those. I found my jacket on the peg and felt the old familiarity of a pocket where I had kept a small buckle. My hands moved with the mechanical memory of a man who has done 100 small tasks until they are muscle. I took my cane from the corner, and for a second the room resembled the field. Light, shadow, the small prophecies that lay in waiting. But the night was not finished with its tricks. As I buttoned the coat, I heard out beyond the house the faint, familiar staccato of a car starting. People pass by, of course. The neighborhood is mostly quiet now, but someone drives for reasons that have nothing to do with me. I stepped to the window, and the streetlight washed the road low and calm. For a second, I imagined all sorts of worldly things, neighbors aghast, phone calls to worried relatives. The ghost was still there in the doorway, patient as the end of a breath. "Do you have to see it?" he asked. I thought of the museum, of the cold steel of a tank that had once been hungry for the smell of fuel and thundered down roads. I thought of how we have made monuments of machines and sometimes forgotten to make monuments of the men who were crushed around them. I thought of the ledger in my head that had a column for decisions and a column for the consequences. I thought, too, of the way a simple apology had landed in the room like rain. "I think I do," I said. He nodded once more, as if that answered a complex theorem. I opened the door for him, though there was no need to do so. Habit tells you to be polite. Habit tells you to offer a cup of tea, to have the kettle on the stove, to do the small communal things that tie strangers together. He did not enter. He stood on the threshold and looked back at me with a patience that belonged to the very old. "Remember," he said, "remember that, whatever you called it, was a man." When I closed the door, the house made a noise like a heart resuming its beat. I sat down again and felt the ache of something unfinished. The jacket on my knees was heavier in the way that the future can be heavy. I told myself I would go to the museum in the morning, that an old man taking a taxi might have sense about him, that children play there, and that the attendants would not be disturbed by my questions. But sleep did not come easy. The lamp burned, and I sat with the photograph on my knee until dawn made the room blue. I turned the picture over and over, as if the back might carry a name. It did not. I am telling you all of this because the visit did not absolve me. It did not confer some miraculous erasure. It was a beginning of a process I had avoided for most of my life. To see the man as he was, not as the war made him into a problem to be solved. That night it felt as if an old wound opened just enough to let air into the scar, and air has a way of making an old thing heal differently. Morning came cold. My daughter called from the city as she does on Sundays. She worries about health, about whether I have eaten. I told her I would be out to see the tank at the museum, and she offered to drive if I wanted. "I can be there in 30 minutes, she said, concern wrapping her speech like twine. "No," I told her. "I'll go alone." There are reasons you refuse help that are not pride. Sometimes you refuse because you are trying to cross a small bridge by yourself to see if it still holds. I told her I would be careful, and she said a few words that could have been prayers,
and then she went quiet in the way people do when they are deciding whether to argue. I took the belt buckle from its tissue and wound it on the chain that used to hold my dog tags. It was a small, talismanic act. I did not know what purpose it served, beyond being a piece of metal in my hand, a tiny connection to a man who might have gone unnamed forever. The light on the photograph caught the buckle and made a loud, tiny gleam that I have tried to describe 100 times and never get right. Outside, the world was a collection of ordinary noises: a garbage truck, a distant dog barking, a leaf skithering along the gutter. The museum is not far, only a 20-minute ride in a car that does not belong to me. I thought about the men I had served with, about the way we used to tell stories over the clatter of pots and the smell of coffee gone bitter. I thought of Tanner, who is buried under a stone I have not visited in years. I thought of the way the past arranges itself like a collection of small hills you walk around, until one day you decide to climb. The ride to the museum would have been unremarkable to anyone watching.
A small car, an old man with a cane, a box folded of old photographs in his lap. There was, perhaps, something of a pilgrim about me. Not a religious one, but a man moving toward a place that might hold an answer. I do not know what I expected. Maybe I thought I would find the man's face pressed into the steel of the tank. Maybe I thought the curators would have a ledger, a record, a name to tie to the figure that had come to my doorway. Maybe I thought the museum would deny me the right to feel anything at all. When I pushed through the museum doors, the smell of wax and old varnish greeted me. Children were running in the distant rooms, supervised by mothers who pointed to dioramas and spoke in small, excited voices about engines and historical curiosities. Up close, the tank is both smaller and bigger than you imagine, a lump of metal with the shape of menace and the weight of history. People have made it into an exhibit, put a small plaque nearby that says nothing of the men who died around it. The plaque is neat. The plaque is official. It does not and cannot tell the story I had been seeking. I stood for a long time and looked at the steel. My fingers found the buckle under my shirt, in that small, private place where a talisman rests. I thought about the man in my doorway and the thinness of his request. I thought about the ways we keep people, how we put them into museums or photographs or stories so that they will not slip into some unmarked grave in memory. Someone came up behind me then and touched my shoulder. It was a curator, perhaps, or a man who worked the gate. He asked if I needed help. There was kindness in him that had nothing to do with my uniform. I told him I had served. He nodded and asked if I would like to see the records. I did not know why my heart jumped. The record room is the place where institutions keep the neat facts, names, dates, serial numbers. It is archival and cold and noble in its own small way. He led me through a doorway that smelled like paper and dust. There were boxes, there were lists, there were the patient arrangements of memory. He brought out a folder, and a photograph slid into view. It was a group shot, soldiers lined in a row, faces sunburned and stern. In the middle, a man wore the same buckle I had. It was not an exact match, but the glint in the color caught my eye the way old things do. My stomach folded. I felt the rise of a peculiar hope that a single name might make a dent in the history that had been pressing on my chest. "Can you tell me if any of these names match?" the curator asked. He had the patience of someone who has seen 1,000 men return to a room and ask to find names that vanished. "We keep lists." I turned the photograph over with fingers that remembered gentle times. On the back, in a hand that had been neat with ink, a name was written. It was not the name I had wanted, nor one I had expected. It was a name that sounded like a place in spring. I had to steady myself against the table. The room tilted briefly. For a man who has carried a thing wordless for most of his life, to see the possibility of a label is a curious thing. I do not know if it is relief or renewed sorrow. Perhaps both have room in the same small body. "If you will excuse me," I said to the curator. I left the room with the photograph tucked into my pocket and the buckle in my hand. The world beyond the record room was loud and ordinary, the way the world is when nothing about it is asked to hold one's sleep. Back at home, the house was as if nothing had happened. The lamp burned and the rug made the old sea sound. I set the photograph on the table and stared at it. The name on the back sat like a card placed on a grave. I could not think of what to do with it. I did not know whether to call a lawyer or a church or a registry. I had known how to load a rifle and how to dig a foxhole. I had not known how to make restitution across 70 years and a name. The unfolding of all this is not a neat affair.
It has the jagged logic of an old wound reopening and becoming a place of work. The man, what I call him now is only the man, for I still do not know whether a name will make him more real, had come to the doorway and asked one small thing: to be remembered. If memory is a coin, then the ticket into memory is sometimes a photograph or a ledger, or the willingness of a man to say that he remembers. But memory can also be a responsibility. It can be an action. So I sat with a photograph and tried to translate its small script into a life. When the phone rang, it was my daughter again. She had been quiet, perhaps because she had a sense that what I did that day was not simply about a museum. She asked if I was all right. I said that I had found something. I did not say what. I told her I had an appointment with the past and would need time. There are practical things this book, this life, has taught me. A photograph is a starting point. Names can be searched. Records can be requested. But there are other less efficient ways to reconcile. There are visits to cemeteries where stones have names. There are archives of towns where a roster might list a man and a home. There are conversations with veterans who remember faces, and with families who kept memory as their native tongue. I intended that evening to begin making calls. I intended to write a letter explaining an apology that might not be wanted, and a story that might not be needed. I intended 1,000 small acts of contrition that sounded dignified when imagined, and clumsy when attempted. I went to bed with the photograph folded in my hand, like a new coin. And then, before I slept, the house shivered in the way it does when rafters settle, and old things readjust. I heard once again the faint smell that I have learned to read as if it were a script. Oil, cold, the sweetness of fuel. In my doorway, before I turned on the lamp, there was a shape.
I had not invited him. I had not promised him. He was there, as if he had followed me from the museum with patient feet. He did not speak immediately. He stood and watched me the way a man watches a slow film of himself living. "You did more than remember," he said finally. "You came looking." "I came to see you as a man," I replied. The words felt like they had more weight now that I had tried to make them mean something beyond the night. "I wanted you to have a name." He nodded as if the name was a small mercy. "Names are anchors," he said. "They keep us from floating away." There are times in life when a sentence lands on you like rain after a drought. I felt that then. The room was very small, and I very old, and the man at my doorway was breathing like a man who had just come in from a cold again. He stepped closer, until I could see the slight tremor in his hands. He reached out with a hand that, for the first time since he had come, felt like someone reaching for an acknowledgement rather than a demand. "Will you tell them?" he asked. "Tell who?" I said. "The ones who I left," he said. "Tell them how it was. Tell them I exist." I had imagined that my acts would be legal notes and letters. I had not imagined the simplicity of a request like that. People think of reconciliation as a business transaction. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is simply the act of saying that one other human was not a footnote, but a person. "I will try," I said. "I will try to give you the place in memory that you deserve." He smiled, and in his smile there was a softness that I had not seen in the yard when he fell. "That's all I ask," he said. The next day, I would start making calls. I would trace names, and I would write a letter that may or may not be received. There would be arguments in my head about whether apology can be retroactive and whether memory can be repaired by acts in the second half of life. There would be days when I would think my efforts useless, and days when a response would come and a widow's voice would answer on the other end of an old telephone. I cannot promise what those days will bring. I can only tell you how the doorway felt when he left, and how I sat afterward with the photograph and the buckle and the small flame of intent. Inside the house, the lamp still burned. Outside, the street was ordinary and unmoved. The photograph lay open on the table like a question waiting for an answer. I did not know if any answer would be enough. There is a longer story to this, of archives and names and the slow arithmetic of reaching across decades, and it began with a single photograph folded into my pocket. What
What followed was less a tidy resolution than a stumble forward, the kind of movement an old man makes when he decides to cross a narrow bridge to see if it holds. I started with the museum's records, because records are where institutions keep their promises.
The curator gave me a list of contacts and a small stack of files. He wore thin gloves and moved like someone touching other people's grief with care. We sat at a long table under a light that softened paper, and he pointed out indexes and unit rosters. He explained how sometimes a name on a photograph matches a name in a registry. Sometimes it doesn't. He told me that sometimes all you find is a scribble and a town that no longer recognizes itself. I learned to write the names down the way I used to load rounds into a magazine, carefully, deliberately, and with the understanding that one mistake could mean a misfire of consequence. There was a surname on the back of that group photograph, a name that had a sound of the countryside to it. It could have been common, or it could have been rare. Either way, it was something to go on. There are small agencies that help people like me, veterans who, late in life, find conversations left unfinished. I talked to one of them on the phone. A woman with a steady voice listened without surprise to a 70-year-old confession. She told me that records in that part of Europe had been moved and relabeled after the war, that parish lists sometimes survived where municipal ones did not, that children often carry the stories of fathers in a way that towns don't. Put it in a letter, she said. Explain who you are. Ask only for a meeting, nothing more. Leave it to them to decide. So I wrote. My handwriting is neat in the way that is more habit than art. I explained the yard at Hansfeld. I explained the photograph in the buckle. I explained that I had carried a man in my head for most of my life, and that I had come, late and clumsy, to find a name to attach to him. I closed the letter with the sort of humility an old man learns when he has less to prove and more to account for. I apologized in the only language I was sure I still had any right to use. Weeks passed. Time thickens at my age. A week is a stone, and 3 pass like a season. I held the photograph in my hands and folded the corners just to feel the texture of hope. My daughter called and scolded me for driving myself to the museum. You look like you're trying to dig up trouble, she said softly. I told her where my hands had gone, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, if you get an answer, you call me first. When the reply came, it arrived in a thin envelope with hand-printed letters. The return address was small and hesitant. Inside, there was a note in a smaller, more precise hand. It began with a statement of disbelief. We cannot imagine why someone would care after so long, and then softened into a short, unadorned account. The man in the photograph had been from a village not far from the depot. He had been a son, then a husband, then a father. He had not returned. The woman who wrote signed her name and included a telephone number. There was no flourish, no righteous fury, only the taut line of someone who had been waiting all her life for something that would make sense of a gap. I sat with the paper for a long time. There is a quality to expectation that is both teeth-grinding and entirely private. I told my daughter, and she called immediately. You have to meet someone with care, she said. They might not want to hear you. I said I knew that, but knowing and doing are different muscles. We arranged a time. I traveled not to a grand courthouse or an office of history, but to a modest home where the curtains were the soft kind that keep summer light from becoming a pain. The woman who opened the door had eyes that watched me over a face lined like a map. Her voice was the same voice that wrote the note. She said my name slowly, like testing a foreign sound for fit. I read your letter, she said. I didn't think it could be true. I had rehearsed fewer sentences than I had thought. All the practiced speeches of a soldier trying to say sorry in civilian clothes fell short. I wanted to say I'm sorry. She let me into the kitchen. There were cups on the table, and a newspaper folded like a promise. Her hands were rough from many years of work, and she moved them as if the small tasks of life could keep the larger ones from spinning into vertigo. She told me a story in pieces. The man who died had been named in her household line as the son who never came home. He had a daughter who was now gone. She had been very young.
She had kept a small box of papers that included the photograph, and when she found it recently, swept from a drawer during a move, she had thought for the first time that perhaps the missing piece could be fixed. "Why now?" she asked. Her question was a stone dropped into the pool of years. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think," and I tried to put into words what the night in my living room had already done to me, the way the presence at the doorway had rearranged my appetite for truth. "I think, when you get old, you decide you cannot take things with you." She did not say the words people think, "It's too late." She did not say, "Don't bother me." She listened as someone who had lived with absences learns to file a new kind of information. After a while, she reached across the table and took the photograph from my hands. She looked at it the way one reads a letter that offers explanation without apology. Then she looked at me, suddenly younger in her expression. "Would you tell me exactly what happened?" she asked. I thought of all the reasons a man tells a story: shame, relief, and urge to be honest. I told her as plainly as I could. The slick road, the cans in his arms, the slide, the shout, the gun, my chest closing like a fist. I spoke of the night being busy, and of how we put our faces to work like masks to get through it. I did not spare the facts. There was no honor in elaboration.
I said the things that up until that moment had been a private ledger balancing out its shame. When I finished, she was still for a long time. Her eyes were wet but methodical. "You say you were young," she said, as if the truth of time could be used to soften the edges. "You say you didn't know his name." "I knew his body," I said. "I knew what it did to my hands afterward." She smiled then, a small, sad tilt, with a patience I had not expected. "We would like to know what he was like," she said. "If you're asking, we would like to hear." So I told her the small things. That he smelled of smoke and of something sweeter. That he carried whatever pride a young man carried. That when he fell, the yard went quiet for a second, and then resumed. I told her about the buckle and how I had wrapped it in tissue like it might be a talisman. I told her I had found a name in a file at the museum, and that, if nothing else, the name gave her family a point to hang their memory on. She placed the photograph back on the table, as if it were a relic, and set her hand over it. "I will speak to my niece," she said. "She is elderly. She may have something. If there is anyone left who remembers." Her voice trailed. The conversation that followed was practical. We exchanged addresses. She told me she had no desire for compensation, that the only thing she wanted was the story to be told honestly. We met again, a week later, at a small town chapel that smelled of pine and polish. It was not at all the scene of cinematic reconciliation. The niece who met me had a voice like a bell and a face like a ledger of winters. She asked questions in sequences. Did he smile? Was he kind? Had he said anything in his last breath? I answered truthfully. I didn't know. She nodded, and then told me, in a way that is both precise and devastating, a brief life history. He had worked in a bakery before the war, had a son who was 2 when he vanished, had an appetite for small kindnesses like sharing bread with neighbors. The niece spoke as if filling in blanks with daylight. We went to the cemetery together. It was a place where the wind had learned how to move around tombstones with respect. The plot where his name had been prescribed for memory was small, a stone that had been placed recently with a simple name. There were a few flowers, not lavish, but enough. I stood by the stone and felt that strange, childish motion of wanting to make repair, but having only a handful of sand. I held the buckle in my palm and placed it at the base of the marker, where it looked very small and very precious. The niece watched, and there was no theatrical restoration. There was only the long, slow swallowing of grief into a hand that refused to always hold it by itself anymore. She told me afterwards that they would keep the photograph in the family box, and that they were glad someone had remembered.
Whether that gladness was for me or the dead, I couldn't tell. It felt enough in the moment.
What struck me most through all of this was how fragile the act of remembering is. Memory is not an automatic machine that keeps everything intact. It is like a garden. If you do not tend it, weeds of omission grow where flowers once stood. I had tended a corner of it in my own way by telling certain stories and leaving out others. I had omitted a man without intending cruelty. Omission is often the lazy sibling of survival. For him and for his family, my choice to remember in a more complete way was a small, late kindness. For me, it was a necessary reckoning. Not all answers were tidy. Not everyone I contacted wanted to meet. Some letters were polite and distant. One reply from a man who had lost an uncle in that sector was short and cold. "You killed him," he wrote. No question, no nuance. He did not want to know me. He did not want a photograph. I understood that. Some wounds do not desire bandages. They want continued waiting to honor the way they have been kept. I wrote back, anyway. I did not expect a reply. There were more practical steps, too. With the help of the museum and a small local historian, I pieced together troop movements and a rough timeline of the depot's fall and the chaos that followed. I learned more about how fuel shortages bent choices into shapes they might not otherwise have taken. I learned how American units intentionally destroyed fuel to deny it to the enemy, how the calculus of supply can force people into watching things burn rather than allow them to change hands. It was an ugly lesson in industrial warfare. Not only was the object of scarcity itself deadly, but the strategies for its denial could turn entire landscapes into pyres. The historian and I had a long conversation about culpability and mitigation. He spoke of orders and of the environment of fear, and he did so without absolving individuals. War makes monsters of convenience, he said, not unkindly, but it also makes men out of choices. It's rarely one or the other. That sentence lodged in me like a splinter. It neither excused me nor condemned me in full. It occupied that uncomfortable center where the past sat like an object I had to handle. Through all this, the presence at my doorway remained an interpretive figure more than a visitor. He returned, sometimes in restless hours, always the same calm, the same request to be remembered. I began to think of him less as a prosecutor and more as an index card with a face on it, the human detail that refuses to be abstracted away. He did not demand confession forever. He asked only for verification that his existence had been acknowledged. The more tangible work did what honest tasks do. It smoothed out my nights. There is a certain grace in making calls and filling forms. It is work with a forward motion. And in the course of that motion, there were small restitutions. I wrote letters to local memorial organizations, asking that his name be added to any lists they kept. I sent a carbon copy of my apology to the small municipal archive in the town near the depot. I signed forms with my full name that felt heavier than they had a month before. One afternoon, as I sat by my window, the house making the familiar sounds of living, I felt the presence again. He stood in the doorway as he always had, impossible and insistently human. He looked at me, and for the first time since the night he appeared, I felt neither accusation nor pity from him. It was more like the expression of a man who has finally been given a place to rest his story on a shelf with others. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple phrase. It did not undo the past. Nothing could. But the sentence did something to my chest, like opening a valve that had been stuck. I found myself answering without thinking. "I'm trying to make it right," I said. I did not know if that was true in any holy sense. I knew only that I was no longer running from the ledger. He nodded. "Remember us as men," he said again, with no small degree of insistence. "Yes," I said. And then, as quietly as he had come, he stepped back, and the doorway filled with ordinary light. Whether he faded or whether my understanding of him simply changed, I cannot say. I only know that after that night, the thing that sat heavy in my chest did not vanish, but shifted. It was like a weight being moved from an open wound to a place where it could be tended. I do not pretend the work is finished. There are letters unanswered and names without faces. There are funerals I will not attend, and apologies I cannot make to the dead in any way that they would receive. There will always be an element of the past that resists neat cataloging.
Memory is not a ledger that can be balanced perfectly, but names matter. A name puts a person into the ledger of human consequence. It stops them from being merely a number filed under collateral and starts the slow work of humanization. If you ask what all this gave me, I will tell you the truth. It gave me a new habit of living with my guilt in daylight. That is not the same as forgiveness, and I do not hood myself in the language of absolution. What it gave me is the ability to say in public and to living kin that I am sorry, and to materialize that sorry into actions, into letters, into visits, into the small acknowledgement that may yet travel to others who keep memory like a family heirloom. In the end, the lesson the war taught me was not a lesson about glory or courage. It was a lesson about scale. Industrial warfare magnifies consequences and minimizes the individual faces that live inside them. Engines and supply lines create the conditions under which men make terrible, tiny choices. Recognizing that does not excuse. It only helps explain why a man like me, who pulled a trigger in a cold field, still wakes to a name and to the quiet persistence of a face in the doorway. The ghost, if that's the right word, did not offer me absolution.
He offered a request that had the moral gravity of a small thing, to be remembered as a man. I have tried to honor that request in the only ways I could. I visited a cemetery. I wrote letters. I spoke to a family and listened. I told parts of the story aloud where before I had kept them locked. Those acts are small. They will not change the course of history, but they are the threads by which one human being re-enters the tapestry of another. If this story reaches you and moves something in you, if it makes you think about the faces behind historical facts, then pass it along. Remember that the machinery of war is made of metal and steel, but it turns on human choices that have names. If you can, visit a memorial, read a list of names, and remember that each entry was a person with habits and a laughter and a toothbrush like anyone else's. I cannot promise you a miraculous end. The past has a way of staying heavy, and sometimes ghosts return to remind us of that weight. But I can tell you what happened in a small house when a man kept a photograph in his pocket and finally turned toward the people he had forgotten to see. The doorway emptied. I put the photograph in a frame and sent a copy to the niece. I kept the buckle in a small box on my shelf, and I slept sometimes with the sense that the ledger of my life had been opened and a page given its proper heading. If this touches you, if there's someone you have been forgetting to name in your life, call them, write them a letter, say the things you have been carrying that are mine to bear no longer. And if you want to learn more stories like this, others who lived with ghosts and names and late reconciliations, share this with someone who cares. Go visit a memorial near you. Look at the names. Remember the men and women inside them.